There I was, 68 years old, standing in the middle of Bonifacio Global City. Thousands of people walked past me, young professionals carrying laptops, parents pushing strollers, friends laughing over coffee. People walking with purpose, like they knew exactly where they were going. I was the only one who looked completely lost. Not because I couldn't find my apartment. I had Google Maps. I knew exactly where I was. I just wasn't sure where I belonged anymore. I'd never traveled alone, not once, not on vacation, not for work, not even for a weekend. For 68 years, I'd always had someone beside me, my husband, a friend, my sister, a coworker, someone. Now, there was no one, just me. I tightened my grip on the handle of my suitcase. People brushed past me without even noticing I existed. And in that moment, a question kept repeating itself inside my head. What have I done? Back in Washington, everyone thought I'd lost my mind. Some tried talking me out of it. Others politely smiled, the way people smile when they think you're making a mistake. One friend actually asked, "Why would a woman your age move halfway around the world by herself?" At the time, I didn't have a good answer. Standing there in the middle of BGC, I wasn't sure I had one now. I remember looking up at the buildings, glass towers stretching into the sky, coffee shops on every corner, palm trees lining wide sidewalks. It wasn't anything like I'd imagined. The Philippines felt modern, busy, alive. But none of that mattered, because I still felt completely alone. And if I'm being honest, I almost turned around. I almost walked straight back to the airport. What I didn't know was that one small conversation with someone I'd never met before would completely change the way I saw this city, and maybe the rest of my life. 3 months earlier, I was still sitting in my little house outside Spokane, wondering why retirement felt nothing like I'd imagined. 3 months earlier, my life looked perfectly normal. At least, that's what everyone else saw. I lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside Spokane. The mortgage had been paid off years earlier, the lawn stayed trimmed, the flowers by the front porch bloomed every spring. Every Tuesday morning, I'd drive to the grocery store. Every Thursday, I'd meet my sister for lunch. Every Sunday, I'd call my daughter in Seattle and my son in Arizona. Nothing was wrong. That was the strange part. Nothing was wrong. I'd spent 42 years as a registered nurse. I worked holidays, night shifts, double shifts. I missed birthdays, Christmas mornings, school plays. There was always another patient who needed me. I told myself, one day I'll have time. One day I'll travel. One day I'll read all those books. One day I'll wake up without setting an alarm. Then retirement arrived, and suddenly I had all the time in the world. It wasn't what I expected. The first few weeks felt wonderful. I slept in, drank coffee on the porch, organized closets that hadn't been touched in years. I even painted the guest bedroom. I stayed busy until there was nothing left to organize. One afternoon, I caught myself watching the clock, not because I had somewhere to be, because I was waiting for it to be time for dinner. That scared me. Not in a dramatic way, just enough to make me wonder, is this really how the next 20 years are going to look? Wake up, drink coffee, watch television, run errands, go to bed, repeat. One evening, my daughter called. She asked what I'd done that day. I started answering, then stopped halfway through. Because honestly, I couldn't remember. The days had started blending together. She laughed gently and said, "Mom, you've earned the right to relax." I smiled. I know. But deep down, I wasn't looking for relaxation anymore. I was looking for purpose. A few weeks later, I found an old photo album while cleaning a closet. There was a picture of me at 24, standing beside a lake, backpack on my shoulders, hair blowing everywhere. I remembered that woman. She wanted to see the world. She talked about traveling, about living somewhere different, about saying yes before fear had a chance to answer. Somewhere along the way, life became responsibilities, then routines, then habits, and before I realized it, 40 years had passed. I sat there holding that photograph for a long time. Finally, I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding. When exactly did I decide I was too old to dream? A few days later, I was returning a stack of library books. Nothing unusual, just another ordinary afternoon. I had no idea that before I walked back out those doors, I'd hear a conversation that would quietly change the direction of my life. The library was almost empty that afternoon. I returned 3 mystery novels I'd finished during the week and wandered toward the exit. As I passed the reading area, I overheard 2 people talking. Normally, I would have kept walking, but one sentence stopped me. "We're heading back to the Philippines next month." I don't know why that caught my attention. Maybe it was because I'd never met anyone who actually lived there. Curious, I slowed my pace. The couple looked to be about my age. They were laughing over coffee as though they were talking about visiting old friends. Not an exotic destination, not some once-in-a-lifetime vacation, just going back. I couldn't help myself. I smiled and asked, "I'm sorry to interrupt. Did you say the Philippines?" The woman smiled immediately. "We did. It's our favorite place." We talked for nearly 45 minutes, not because they were trying to convince me of anything, because I kept asking questions. What made you choose the Philippines? Is it safe? Do you ever feel lonely? What about the language? What happens if you get sick? Every question I'd been quietly wondering came spilling out. The husband answered one that stayed with me. He smiled and said, "You know, people ask us if we're brave." He looked at his wife. "We don't feel brave. We just got tired of putting life off." That sentence followed me all the way home. We just got tired of putting life off. I must have repeated it to myself a dozen times, because if I was honest, that's exactly what I'd been doing. Waiting for the perfect time, the perfect reason, the perfect moment, as if one morning life would suddenly announce that it was finally safe to begin again. Before we left, the woman reached into her purse. She handed me a small piece of paper. Written across it was one name, BGC, Bonifacio Global City. She smiled. If you've never traveled alone, this might be a good place to start. It's modern, walkable, lots of English speakers, and you'll probably be surprised by how comfortable it feels. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. I still have it. That evening, instead of turning on the television, I opened my laptop. I typed 4 words into YouTube. Living in BGC, Philippines. 1 video became 2. 2 became 10. I watched people walking through parks, families eating outside, coffee shops, wide sidewalks, modern grocery stores, condominium tours. It didn't look anything like the picture I'd carried in my mind for years. Every video seemed to replace one fear with one question. What if? What if I could actually do this? What if I wasn't too old? What if everyone else was wrong? For the next several weeks, my search history completely changed. Apartment prices, monthly budgets, tourist visas, healthcare. How much did groceries cost? Could I really rent a nice condo? Could I afford retirement there? I learned that a comfortable one-bedroom apartment in BGC might cost somewhere around 35,000 to 45,000 pesos a month. Not cheap by Philippine standards, but still within the retirement budget I'd carefully built over decades. For the first time in years, I wasn't researching something because I had to. I was researching something because I couldn't stop thinking about it. Eventually, my daughter noticed. She looked at me one evening over a video call and laughed. "Mom, why do you suddenly know so much about the Philippines?" I laughed too. I honestly don't know. But deep inside, I think I already did. Because somewhere between those YouTube videos, that folded piece of paper, and one conversation in a quiet library, my impossible dream had quietly become a plan. For almost a month, I didn't tell anyone what I was thinking. Not because it was a secret, because saying it out loud would make it real. Instead, I researched quietly. Every morning started the same way: coffee, notebook, laptop. One page in my notebook became 10. I wrote down everything: monthly budgets, visa information, flight prices, condominium rentals, questions I didn't even know who to ask. I wasn't planning a vacation anymore. I was planning a completely different life. One afternoon, I finally picked up the phone and called my daughter. She answered with her usual cheerful, "Hi, Mom." We talked about ordinary things for a few minutes: the grandchildren, the weather, her garden. Then I took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about something." She immediately knew. "What is it?" I hesitated. "I'm thinking about moving to the Philippines." There was complete silence. Not an awkward silence, just surprise. Finally, she laughed softly. "For a vacation?" "No, I mean moving." Another pause. Then came the question I had expected all along. "By yourself?" I understood why she asked. Honestly, I'd been asking myself the same thing every day. Yes, by myself. She wasn't angry. She wasn't dismissive. She was worried. What if something happens? What if you get sick? What if you don't like it? What if you get lonely? Every one of those questions had already kept me awake at night. I didn't have perfect answers, only one. If I never try, I'll always wonder. My son reacted differently. He laughed. Not because he thought it was funny, because he thought I was joking. "Mom, you're serious?" "I've never been more serious." He sighed. "I just don't understand. Why leave now?" That question stayed with me for days. Why leave now? The answer finally came to me while I was watering the flowers on my front porch. Because if not now, when? I wasn't getting younger. I wasn't becoming more adventurous. I wasn't suddenly going to wake up at 75 with fewer reasons to be afraid. Waiting wasn't making fear smaller. It was making my world smaller. A few weeks later, I booked the flight. I stared at the confirmation email for almost an hour. One click. That's all it took. Months of wondering ended with one click. Then reality hit. I wasn't imagining this anymore. I was actually leaving. The following Saturday, my sister came over. We sat on the back porch drinking iced tea. I finally told her. She reached across the table and held my hand. "You've always wanted to see the world." I smiled. "I know. I just never thought I'd start at 68. She smiled back. maybe that's exactly when you're supposed to start. The weeks that followed felt strangely peaceful. I donated boxes of things I hadn't used in years, packed only what mattered. 2 suitcases, a carry-on, family photographs, my passport, a few favorite books, the notebook I'd filled over the past month, and tucked inside the front pocket, the little folded piece of paper with 3 letters written across it. B-G-C. Every time I saw it, I remembered that afternoon in the library. Sometimes our lives don't change because of one giant decision. Sometimes they change because someone takes 10 minutes to answer a stranger's questions. The night before my flight, I walked through my house one last time. The rooms were almost empty. The walls echoed. I stood in the living room, looking out the same window I'd looked through for years. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what I was leaving behind. I was thinking about the woman standing in that airport, wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. I didn't know her yet, but I was about to become her. The flight itself passed in a blur. Hours seemed to disappear somewhere over the Pacific. I slept a little, watched a movie I couldn't remember, looked out the window far more than I usually would. Every once in a while, I'd reach into my carry-on, not for my passport, not for my phone, for that little folded piece of paper, B-G-C. It was amazing how 3 handwritten letters could calm my nerves. When the airplane finally touched down, my heart started racing. This was it. There was no longer a plan, there was only reality. I followed everyone through the airport. Passport, immigration, luggage, customs. Everything I'd spent months worrying about turned out to be surprisingly simple. The immigration officer smiled politely, stamped my passport. Enjoy your stay. Just like that, I was in the Philippines. Outside the airport, the warm air hit me immediately. Even in the evening, it felt completely different from Washington. There were people everywhere, families greeting one another, drivers holding signs, taxi attendants helping travelers. For a moment, I simply stood there taking it all in. Then I remembered something. I was alone. The taxi driver loaded my suitcases into the trunk. He smiled through the rearview mirror. "First time in the Philippines, ma'am?" "Yes." "You'll like it here." I smiled politely. I hoped he was right. As we drove toward Bonifacio Global City, I pressed my forehead gently against the window. The city lights stretched farther than I expected. Tall buildings, busy roads, restaurants still filled with people, joggers along the sidewalks, couples walking hand in hand. Nothing looked unfamiliar because it was dangerous. It looked unfamiliar because none of it belonged to my life yet. When the taxi pulled in front of my condominium, I suddenly froze. The driver unloaded my luggage. I thanked him. He drove away. And just like that, I was standing there, completely alone, for the first time in my life. I remember looking around. People were laughing outside nearby restaurants. Someone walked past carrying groceries. A security guard greeted residents by name as they came through the entrance. Everyone belonged somewhere, except me. The elevator ride to my apartment felt strangely quiet. I unlocked the door, rolled my 2 suitcases inside, closed it behind me. Then, everything became silent. The apartment was exactly what I'd rented online. Clean, modern, comfortable. A small kitchen, a sofa, a balcony overlooking the lights of BGC. It should have felt exciting. Instead, it felt empty. I sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing my shoes, still holding my passport. I don't know how long I stayed there. 5 minutes, maybe 20. Eventually, I walked out onto the balcony. The city below looked beautiful. People were still eating dinner. Traffic moved steadily through the streets. Life continued exactly as it had before I arrived. And suddenly, I started crying. Not because anything had gone wrong, nothing had. I cried because everything suddenly felt real. My family was nearly 7,000 miles away. Nobody knew me here. Nobody was expecting me tomorrow. Nobody was going to knock on my door and ask if I was okay. I had never felt so independent or so vulnerable at the exact same time. I reached for my phone. For a moment, I actually opened the airline website. My finger hovered over the search box, flights back to Seattle. I stared at the screen. I could leave. No one would blame me. I'd given it a try. That would be enough, wouldn't it? Then something caught my eye. Lying on the little kitchen counter was the folded piece of paper. BGC. I picked it up, turned it over, and remembered something the woman in the library had said. If you've never traveled alone, give yourself 1 week. Don't make any big decisions before then. 1 week. I whispered those words to myself. Not 1 month, not 1 year, just 1 week. I closed the airline website, made myself one promise. No matter how frightened I felt, I would stay for 7 days. After that, if I still wanted to go home, I could. I placed the folded paper beside my bed, turned off the light, and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of a city that, one day, would begin to feel like home. The next morning, I almost stayed inside, not because I was tired, because walking outside meant admitting this wasn't a vacation anymore. This was my life, at least for the next 7 days. I remembered the promise I'd made myself. No major decisions, no booking flights home, just live 1 day. I got dressed, grabbed my little notebook, locked the apartment door, and stepped outside. The first thing I noticed was how many people were walking. Not rushing, walking. Young professionals carrying coffee, parents pushing strollers, older couples enjoying the morning air, joggers weaving through the sidewalks. For a busy city, it felt surprisingly peaceful. I found myself smiling, maybe because I finally realized I could walk too. No rental car, no confusing highways, no worrying about directions every few minutes. Everything felt close. Everything felt designed for people. Eventually, I wandered into a small coffee shop. The menu looked familiar enough. 1 cappuccino, 1 croissant. I carried my tray to a window seat. When they called my name, I almost laughed. Hearing Susan, spoken with a warm smile, instead of over a hospital intercom, felt strangely comforting. The total came to just under 300 pesos. Back home, I'd paid almost that much for coffee alone. For the next hour, I simply watched people. No one stared at me. No one questioned why I was sitting there alone. I wasn't unusual. I was just another customer enjoying a quiet morning. Somehow, that made me feel less alone. Later that afternoon, I stopped at the grocery store. It wasn't as overwhelming as I'd imagined. Fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, rows of familiar products mixed with brands I'd never seen before. I filled a small basket with the basics: eggs, bread, chicken, rice, yogurt, coffee, bottled water. When I reached the checkout, the total came to a little over 2,000 pesos. I stood there for a moment, doing the math in my head. It wasn't unbelievably cheap, but it fit comfortably within the budget I'd spent weeks calculating back home. For the first time, my retirement budget didn't feel like numbers on a spreadsheet. It felt like a real life. On my third morning, I decided to walk through High Street. I'd seen it dozens of times on YouTube. Somehow, it looked completely different in person. Children chased bubbles across the open plaza. Friends sat talking beneath the trees. People walked their dogs before work. Someone played guitar near a fountain. It felt alive, but never rushed. I found an empty bench and simply sat there, watching, listening, breathing. For the first time since landing, I wasn't thinking about home. I was thinking about tomorrow. By the 5th day, little things had already started changing. The security guard at my building smiled before I even reached the entrance. "Good morning, ma'am." The young woman at the coffee shop looked up and said, "Cappuccino again?" I laughed. "I guess I'm becoming predictable." She laughed too. "That's okay. It means you're becoming a regular." A regular. Such a simple word. Yet hearing it filled me with a feeling I hadn't expected. Belonging. That evening, I carried my coffee onto the balcony. The city looked exactly the same as it had on my first night. The lights, the traffic, the laughter drifting up from the restaurants below. Nothing had changed, except me. I thought back to the woman who had stood in that exact spot, with tears in her eyes, wondering if she should go home. She still existed. She was still afraid, but she was no longer making every decision. Confidence hadn't replaced fear. It had simply started walking beside it. On the morning of the 7th day, I woke up before my alarm, made coffee, opened the balcony door, and smiled. Without even thinking about it, I'd started planning what I wanted to do the following week. Only then did I realize I'd forgotten all about the airline website. I wasn't counting the days anymore. I was beginning to count memories. A few weeks after arriving, I realized something. I wasn't waking up wondering if I'd made a mistake anymore. I was waking up wondering what I wanted to do that day. It was a small difference, but it changed everything. One Tuesday morning, I took the short walk to the Bureau of Immigration. Months earlier, that trip would have terrified me. Now, it felt like another errand. I carried my passport, filled out the paperwork, waited my turn, paid the extension fee, smiled at the officer, then walked back outside into the warm Manila air. The entire process had taken less time than one of my old doctor's appointments back home. As I slipped my passport into my bag, I caught myself smiling. I hadn't just extended my visa. I'd extended a life I wasn't ready to leave. That evening, my daughter called. She asked the same questions she always asked. "How's your apartment? Have you been eating? Have you figured out the grocery store yet?" I laughed. "I think I know every aisle by now." Then she asked, "So, how are you really?" I looked out across the lights of BGC before answering. I stopped for a moment. I think I'm happy. The words surprised me as much as they surprised her. Not because I hadn't been happy, because I hadn't realized I'd finally stopped surviving and started living. There was silence on the phone. Then she quietly said, "Mom, you sound different." I smiled. "Different how?" She laughed softly. "Lighter. I haven't heard your voice like this in years." I didn't know what to say, because she was right. The fear hadn't disappeared. Sometimes I still missed home. Sometimes I still wondered what everyone back in Washington was doing. Sometimes I wished I could hug my grandchildren. But those feelings no longer filled every room in my heart. There was space now for curiosity, for excitement, for tomorrow. Before we hung up, my youngest grandson grabbed the phone. "Grandma, when are you coming home?" I smiled. "Soon." Then he asked another question. "When are you going back to your apartment?" Not, "When are you going back to the Philippines?" not, "When are you going back overseas?" He called it my apartment, my place. Somehow, without even realizing it, my family had accepted something I was only beginning to understand myself. Home didn't have to be just one place anymore. After we said goodbye, I sat quietly on the balcony. The folded piece of paper was still tucked inside my notebook. The ink had started fading. BGC, 3 little letters. A stranger had written them on a quiet afternoon without ever knowing what they would mean to me. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness become the biggest turning points in someone else's life. 6 months later. I found myself standing in exactly the same place where this story began, Bonifacio Global City. The sidewalks were just as busy. The restaurants were just as full. People hurried past carrying shopping bags and coffee cups. Nothing about the city had changed. This time, I wasn't standing there wondering if I'd made a mistake. I was waiting for a friend, a woman I'd met during one of my morning walks. We'd started talking over coffee. Now we met every Wednesday. Sometimes we walked, sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we simply watched the city together. Life has a funny way of introducing people exactly when you need them. As I waited, I remembered that frightened woman who had stepped out of a taxi months earlier. She thought being alone meant nobody would know her. Nobody would notice her. Nobody would care. She couldn't have been more wrong. The security guard smiled every morning. The young barista already knew my order. The cashier at the grocery store asked how my week had been. The flower vendor waved whenever I walked by. I hadn't found perfection. I'd found community. People sometimes ask if moving to the Philippines changed my life. I always smile, because I don't think the Philippines changed me. It gave me the space to become the version of myself I'd quietly set aside while taking care of everyone else. For more than 40 years, I had been a nurse, a wife, a mother, a grandmother. Those parts of my life will always matter. But somewhere between the wide sidewalks of BGC, the little coffee shop, and one folded piece of paper, I remembered something else. I was still Susan, and Susan still had dreams worth chasing. People have called me brave. I appreciate that. But bravery isn't waking up without fear. Bravery is carrying your fear with you and taking the next step anyway. I was terrified when I arrived. If I'm honest, there are still days when I feel uncertain. The difference is, uncertainty no longer decides where my life goes. I do. If someone had told me a year earlier that I'd be living alone in Manila, I would have laughed. If they'd told me I'd feel at home here, I never would have believed them. Yet here I was, waiting for a friend, planning next week's grocery trip, thinking about where I wanted to explore next. Not surviving, living. Sometimes people spend years waiting for permission to begin again. I've learned that permission never arrives. One day, you simply decide your life isn't over yet, and you take the first step, even if your hands are shaking. Looking back, I wasn't searching for another country. I was searching for another chapter, and somehow I found both. If you're standing at the edge of a decision that scares you, I can't tell you what the right choice is, but I can tell you this. The most frightening day of my life became the beginning of the happiest chapter I've ever lived. And for me, that made every uncertain step worth taking.